I'm John Strum, and this is Real Talk MS. It's October 7th, and we have a lot to talk about. Specifically, there's lots of news from ECTRIMS still to share, but we also want to pay attention to the events that can affect people living with MS, events that are taking place in the world today. For instance, the Stratus strain of COVID-19 is currently surging in the United States. So this seems like a good time to remind you that the National MS Society recommends that most people living with MS get the COVID-19 vaccination and stay current with boosters as they become available. And I realize for some of you that means coordinating when you receive your next DMT infusion. I also realize that some of you may have questions about how a COVID-19 infection might impact someone living with MS. Well, today we have evidence that didn't exist 5 years ago when the world was living through a frightening pandemic. And Dr. Robert Fox, the managing director of the NARCOMS Patient Registry, will be joining me later in today's episode to discuss how COVID-19 infection, along with other infections, impact people with MS. But before we get to my conversation with Dr. Fox, there are a few other things that you should know about. In the weeks leading up to ECTRIMS, I mentioned that many attendees would be anxiously watching to see whether the FDA granted approval for Tolebrutinib, the first in a new category of disease-modifying therapies called BTK inhibitors, to be considered for approval. Well, that anticipation will have to continue until the end of the year. The FDA has extended its review of Tolebrutinib by 3 months, setting a new target action date of December 28, 2025. The extension is a result of new analyses that were submitted during the review, which the FDA says warrants changes to the new drug application. As I just mentioned, Tolebrutinib is a BTK inhibitor. The BTK stands for Bruton's tyrosine kinase, which is a long name for a protein that plays an important role in the development of B cells. A BTK inhibitor blocks the activity of this protein. And one thing that makes Tolebrutinib particularly important is that it can cross the blood-brain barrier, so it can target B cells in the central nervous system, making Tolebrutinib the first and only brain-penetrant BTK inhibitor that's been shown to be effective in treating non-relapsing secondary progressive MS and slowing disability progression independent of relapse activity. Now, some approved DMTs have been shown to delay progression following a relapse, but Tolebrutinib is the only DMT that's been shown to delay disability progression independent of relapse activity. And progression independent of relapse activity, often referred to by the acronym PIRA, is something that we've heard a lot about over the past 24 months. It refers to the worsening of MS symptoms and disability that occurs even when someone isn't experiencing active inflammation or new lesions in the brain. So you can understand why, even with more than 20 already approved disease-modifying therapies available today, there's still a lot of anticipation surrounding Tolebrutinib. You can be sure that we've already circled December 28th on our calendar, and we'll be ready to share the FDA's decision as soon as it's announced. Many of you probably know that there's a specific gene that increases the risk that someone will develop MS. But did you ever wonder where or why that gene exists? Fortunately for us, Professor Lars Fugger at the University of Oxford did wonder about that question, and he and his research team set out to answer it. Professor Fugger's research took scientists back 5,000 years in human history, when a tribe of nomadic herders called the Yamnaya migrated to Europe from an area that's now Ukraine. I was very fortunate to meet up with Professor Fugger at ECTRIMS, and in a moment, you'll hear our conversation about the origin of the specific genes that elevate the risk that someone will develop multiple sclerosis. Professor Lars Fugger is a professor of neuroimmunology in the Newfield Department of Clinical Neurosciences at the University of Oxford. Professor Fugger has been working on neurodegenerative diseases since 1987, and he has been honored with numerous international awards for his research, including the Sobek Prize, which is the largest European MS research prize, and the European Commission's Prize for Scientific Excellence, among many others. One of Professor Fugger's ECTRIMS presentations is entitled Ancient DNA Reveals Origins of Multiple Sclerosis in Europe. Certain genetic profiles show that some people are at a higher risk for developing MS than others. You and your team set out to answer the question, where does that genetic propensity come from? Tell me, what did you learn?
So what we learned was that the risk, and it's important to point out, it's the risk of getting MS, came from a steppe population that lived where Ukraine is today, near the Black Sea. And this steppe population was different from other populations living in that area because they started to live with domestic animals. And by doing that, they were also exposed to all their pathogens. They were also drinking their milk, which was not pasteurized. They were eating their meat, which likely was undercooked. And because of that, there was a 24/7 bombardment of all kinds of pathogens. And clearly that has been unhelpful and unhealthy, and this is a story of the strongest will survive. So out of that came what we call selection, those who could battle that onslaught of pathogens survived. And it turned out that the genes that would sort of secure these people survived are now the same genes we today see as risk genes in MS. So the important thing here to point out is that the risk genes in MS are actually selected for being really good to fight pathogens. They are strong immune genes.
So if we look at the population history of Europe, the way that humans settled in different parts of the continent, do you see that reflected in the modern-day distribution of MS?
Yes, that's a clear yes, because we can follow how the Yamnayas, how the steppe population from Ukraine, how it migrated up towards the Scandinavian countries. And today we can see we have one of the highest prevalences of MS in northern Germany, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. And that is exactly where the Yamnayas went.
What about people who didn't migrate from Europe? For instance, how does your research explain the genetic propensity to, or the risk to develop MS among the African American population?
So that's a really good question, because when you're looking in the African population, there's a lower risk, to the extent that Africans rarely get MS. But what happens is when you have the African American population, where it will not only be African genes, but there will be also sort of genes that were brought to the US by Europeans. When those genes mix, the risk will go up. But also clearly, when you're living in the States, there's a complete change in lifestyle. And what we found in our study was lifestyle is a massive risk factor in getting MS. So it's a combination, again, of genetic setup clashing with lifestyle.
Speaking of that, I was about to say your research really demonstrates that even thousands of years ago, lifestyle changes drove changes in the risk of developing MS. It seems like that can be as true today as it was then.
Oh, it is very true. And I think it's important to bear in mind when we're looking at MS, we need to bear in mind it's what I call a complex disease. So we have several factors coming together, and we have genes that might account for 1/3 of the risk, but we have environmental factors that will account for the rest, which is almost 2/3 of the risk. And if you're looking at the genetic risk factors, we are in MS talking about 300 plus genetic risk factors. Most of them are really minor. When we're looking at the environmental factors, some of them are actually quite substantial. So that is an ever-changing picture, because when we're looking at the incidence of MS during the last 50 years, it has gone up. And what we can see is, it should be seen in the light of that we now have better hygiene, we have vaccinations, we know how to pasteurize food and so forth. So the onslaught of pathogens have clearly gone down in certain areas of the world. But the risk genes are still there, and they are genes that will sort of create a hugely fierce immune response to whatever they run into. So in a popular way, you could say all of a sudden these genes are becoming unoccupied, and they will sort of latch onto other stuff which could cause autoimmune diseases like MS.
Professor Fugger, I want to thank you for all your remarkable contributions to MS research. Thanks so much for spending a few minutes talking with me today.
Well, thank you for taking your time, and thank you to all the patients who have been listening to this.
While I was at ECTRIMS, I also connected with Jason Tardio, the President and Chief Operating Officer of Immunic, along with Dr. Andreas Mueller, Immunic's Chief Medical Officer. And we had a conversation about vidofludimus calcium, an investigative MS therapy that may offer anti-inflammatory, neuroprotective, and antiviral benefits. In a moment, you'll hear our conversation. Jason Tardio is the President and Chief Operating Officer, and Dr. Andreas Mueller is the Chief Medical Officer at Immunic Therapeutics. And Immunic has been on our radar, certainly this past year, when results from their phase 2 clinical trials for vidofludimus calcium were published. It may be obvious to some, but what brings you to ECTRIMS?
Well, ECTRIMS is the most exciting medical conference every year focused on multiple sclerosis. And so clearly, as a company who's developing a late-stage asset for this important disease, we're here to discuss new data specific to vidofludimus calcium, but also to engage with the MS community, both treating clinicians, researchers, patient advocacy groups, just to increase awareness, again, of Immunic Therapeutics and of our exciting late-stage asset, vidofludimus calcium.
Dr. Mueller, what stood out to you in the outcome of the phase 2 clinical trials for vidofludimus calcium?
I think the Caliper trial, really the most important outcome for me was that we have really proven the hypothesis that Nurr1 activation may have clinical neuroprotective effects. And this is the first indication with this phase 2 Caliper outcome was that we have more or less the same effect on confirmed disability worsening, but even removing the patients who have gadolinium-enhancing lesions. So it means that are still active, still have focal inflammation. And that has not been seen in other clinical trials in progressive MS before. So we are quite happy about this.
If vidofludimus calcium continues to demonstrate neuroprotection, anti-inflammatory, and antiviral properties, it represents a pretty unique treatment option, doesn't it?
Absolutely. We see this as actually it can treat MS in its entirety. There's a lot of move now in the scientific medical community that actually MS is one continuum of disease. So we have this very artificial separation of different stages, relapsing, remitting, and, active SPMS and so forth. And I think there's more and more understanding of the biology that this is basically one continuum. And we see that with all of these three mechanisms, yes, anti-inflammatory, antiviral, and neuroprotective, we can actually be well positioned in any of this continuum. So I think this is a drug that probably can be used in any of the stages of the disease. So that's the exciting thing for us as a company, and for me as a clinical scientist.
You started to answer my next question. Take all the information we just shared. What does that mean for someone living with MS?
In a lot of ways, I think sometimes it is difficult for MS patients to get the right treatment, yes, because you have a lot of drugs who are approved for relapsing MS, but you have none for non-active secondary progressive, and you have just one that made it into a label for primary progressive. So a lot of physicians don't like to send patients home without treatment. So they kind of also think about, do I label this patient now non-active secondary progressive? Because it basically means the insurance will not cover you. Yeah. So in a lot of ways, I think this is also very helpful to really get to a stage where we have drugs for these different entities so that the patients can be really treated with the most appropriate treatment, and there's available treatment for all of these different phases of their journey through this disease. And I think that's what we think is very important for these patients.
Well, speaking of the phases of the disease, let's talk about the phases of clinical trials. What is the status of a phase 3 clinical trial?
So a phase 3 clinical trial is, of course, at the end of clinical development, where we really want to prove efficacy of the drug in a certain disease. So we have a fully enrolled phase 3 trial, a phase 3 program with 2 phase 3 trials that are fully enrolled now. We're in the follow-up period of these patients, and we expect to present data from both of these phase 3 trials at the end of 2026.
Well, I'm going to mark that on my calendar. We'll be talking for sure, if not before then. We'll look forward to hearing more news about vidofludimus calcium as it goes through the process and hopefully makes its way to being available to people living with MS. Jason, Dr. Mueller, I want to thank you both for talking with me today.
All right. Thank you very much.
4 or 5 years ago, at the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, everyone in the MS community wondered, make that worried, about how a COVID-19 infection would impact someone living with MS. Well, experts have learned a lot over the past 5 years. And as a new strain of COVID-19 is currently surging in the United States, I think we're all grateful that that research continued. In a moment, Dr. Robert Fox joins me with an evidence-based research update on how the COVID-19 infection, as well as other infections, impact people with MS. As is typical this time of year, COVID-19 is surging in the United States. And in the midst of less testing, the discontinuation of some of the tools that researchers use to accurately measure the spread of COVID, deep budget cuts and questionable guidance from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the available evidence still shows COVID-19 is particularly widespread in the southwestern and western United States, while gaining ground in the Midwest. The longer we live with COVID-19, the more scientists are learning about the effect this virus has on specific populations. Dr. Robert Fox is joining me today to talk about the impact of infections, including and maybe especially infection from COVID-19, on people who are living with MS. Dr. Fox is a neurologist at the Cleveland Clinic's Mellon Center for Multiple Sclerosis Treatment and Research, as well as the vice chair of research at the Cleveland Clinic Neurological Institute. Dr. Fox is also a professor of neurology at the Cleveland Clinic Lerner College of Medicine. He chairs the International Progressive MS Alliance Scientific Steering Committee, and Dr. Fox serves as the managing director of the NARCOMS Patient Registry. NARCOMS is an acronym for the North American Research Committee on Multiple Sclerosis, and if you aren't already participating in the NARCOMS Patient Registry, I hope you'll consider joining today. But first, let me say welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Fox.
John, thanks very much for having me back. It's a pleasure to be joining you.
We're going to get into the evidence in just a moment because, honestly, that's what NARCOMS is really all about, being able to provide a snapshot of how thousands of people with MS are living with real-world challenges like COVID-19 and other infections. I'm hoping you can give us an overview of what NARCOMS is and what it does.
Sure. NARCOMS is a registry. A registry is a place where people can share their information about their MS experience, so researchers can learn more about the disease. After an enrollment survey, NARCOMS sends surveys twice a year, once in the fall and once in the spring. Surveys take about 30 to 45 minutes to complete, and they can be completed online or via U.S. mail. And so this is an opportunity for people to participate in MS research by sharing their experience, their personal experience with MS, and participate in research from the comfort of their living room or their office or their bedroom.
Now, NARCOMS data has been used in 3 different studies that analyzed the impact of infections on people with MS. One of those studies is titled Effects of COVID-19 Infection on Symptom Severity and Disability in Multiple Sclerosis. What can you tell me about this study?
Well, in that study, we explored whether COVID-19 and other infections can affect the trajectory or the course of MS, how much disability a patient reports having, and their particular symptoms. So we use data from NARCOMS to understand the association of symptom severity and the incidence of COVID-19 infection and other infections. So we had 2,000 participants who shared that they had tested positive for COVID-19 in the past 6 months, and about 1,500 who had no COVID or other major infection over that time period. We also compared to about 800 people who were positive for COVID, and a subset of those participants, we had long-term data to see how their disease, their MS course, fared prior to infection and how it fared after infection. And after we adjusted for things such as MS treatments and their age and their disease history, what we found is very reassuring that COVID-19 had a negligible impact on the course of the disease, both in terms of the disability, and this is a patient-reported disability scale, as well as individual symptoms across the array of symptoms that MS can cause. So the change in the level of disability using that self-reported disability scale was negligible. And so ultimately, we found that there was no significant impact of COVID-19 infection on either the disability progression over time or the severity of symptoms.
You know, as you were sharing that information, I was thinking to myself, people sure would have loved to have heard this in 2020 and 2021, wouldn't they?
Absolutely. And it's not to say that COVID doesn't impact people. It's clearly an infection that can cause a lot of symptoms and a lot of trouble for people. But it is reassuring that the overall disease course of MS is not affected.
I think everyone probably knows someone who had COVID-19 and then experienced long-term, sometimes quite serious symptoms, often referred to as long COVID. Now, NARCOMS data was used to study how long COVID was impacting people with MS. So first, can you tell us how long COVID presents? And then please tell us what you learned in this study.
Long COVID is a syndrome, and in fact, post-acute sequela, or PASC, P-A-S-C is the acronym, is a constellation of symptoms that can be seen long after an infection seems to have cleared someone's body. So we've been familiar with this post-acute sequela, or PASC, of a variety of infections. So this was understood and recognized long before COVID developed, but it's most notable and most recognized around COVID. And the term, as you relate it, long COVID, has become sort of a commonly used term. And these symptoms are quite varied. They can include fatigue and cognitive difficulties, loss of smell, loss of taste, also other symptoms that sound similar to those of MS. And what we found is that amongst those who had COVID in the recent months, about 10% reported symptoms of long COVID, or these persistent symptoms after the infection. Now, what surprised us is that although it was 10% of COVID infection participants, it was almost 30% of those with non-COVID infections. So what we found is those who had infections other than COVID were even more likely to have these chronic long-term symptoms. Now, to make it a little bit more complicated, is that when we looked at the overlap of these symptoms with MS symptoms, they're very, very similar. Of course, concentration problems, fatigue. And what we found is new long COVID, or the incidence of patients who had newly developed symptoms of long COVID that weren't there before COVID, was actually very, very rare. It was very uncommon. Now, part of it is because a lot of those symptoms were there already. And so part of the definition of long COVID is that these are new symptoms. And so what that highlights is that long COVID is really tricky in people with MS because of the overlap of long COVID symptoms and just symptoms of MS.
Infections typically increase the risk of someone with MS experiencing either a relapse or a pseudo-relapse. Now, I'm quite sure that my listeners are well acquainted with what an MS relapse is. I'm hoping you can just give us a quick reminder about what a pseudo-relapse is, and then tell us about this third study, which focused on infections, relapses, and pseudo-relapses in individuals with MS.
As most or all of your listeners know, the typical symptoms of a relapse can be blurry vision, double vision, weakness, numbness, coordination problems, walking problems. And the important aspect of a relapse definition is that there's no other explanation for the symptoms. And we know that many things can make previous symptoms worse. And so what we call pseudo-relapse is a worsening of symptoms, particularly pre-existing symptoms, that are not from an MS relapse. And an infection is a very common trigger of worsening symptoms that turn out not quite to be from relapse. So what we looked at was whether COVID and other infections would trigger a relapse and whether they would trigger a pseudo-relapse.
And what did you find?
What we found is that non-COVID infections were associated with a risk of relapse after the infection. And these are relapses that were identified by our participants and their care providers, their MS providers. So the non-COVID infections were associated with a slightly higher risk of infections. But fortunately, COVID infection was not. And in fact, COVID was associated with a lower risk of a relapse after developing the COVID infection. Now, I don't want to go so far as to say COVID was protective against relapse, but at least we observed from the data that our participants reported that the frequency or the risk of relapse was lower after a COVID infection than no infection at all. Now, what we also found is that all infections, both COVID and non-COVID infections, were associated with a higher risk of pseudo-relapse, that worsening of symptoms that were not considered to be a relapse by the person's MS provider. And during the period after infection, there was about a 75% higher risk of a pseudo-relapse for either COVID or non-COVID infections. And importantly, patients who were unfortunate in getting COVID and non-COVID infections together, the double whammy, they had a threefold higher risk of a pseudo-relapse. So it highlights how different infections may combine together to really worsen symptoms that are called the pseudo-relapse.
Well, considering all the information from these three studies, what do you see as a takeaway when it comes to understanding how infections impact people living with MS?
Well, it's reassuring that COVID and other infections don't seem to alter the long-term course of MS. And so that's reassuring. However, infections do have a temporary or transient impact. They can cause pseudo-relapse, and they can be associated with long-term symptoms. And what we had thought of as being specific for COVID, that long COVID, is probably seen with many of our infections. And so although long-term disability progression doesn't seem to be worsened by infections, including COVID, symptoms can be. And so it definitely is important for patients to work hard to prevent infections, whether that's through vaccines, quick recognition of infection so they can get treated, and other preventative strategies to prevent infections.
Everything we've been talking about, what we have learned about the impact of infections on people with MS, the impact of COVID-19 on the MS community, we learned through NARCOMS surveys. And in introducing this segment, I invited our listeners to give serious consideration to participating in NARCOMS. How does someone get started?
The easiest way is to go to our website, which is narcoms.org, narcoms.org. We also have an email. We have a telephone number people can call as well. But the easiest is through our website, and there's a button there to click and to sign up. We keep all information confidential. No names are released. When we work with other researchers, we never release the names and the contact information of our participants. And some we have been following for over 25 years, and that is just such a treasure trove of information of someone's disease course from their perspective. So this truly is an opportunity for people to get directly involved in the research of their disease from the comfort of their home.
Well, Dr. Robert Fox, I want to thank you for all you do to improve the lives of people living with MS. It's always a treat to have you join me on the podcast. Thanks so much for talking with me today.
Thanks for having me, John. I enjoyed it.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society. And you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/423. You'll find that link in today's show notes so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. Next week, I'll be sharing more news from the largest MS research conference in the world. And later this week, be sure to catch the next episode in our special podcast series on MS clinical trials, as well as our video series of ECTRIMS Extra Conversations, and you'll find those on the Real Talk MS YouTube channel. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.